Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
Varshini, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, I got to start by just saying I am so honored to be talking with you. The work you're doing right now is just giving me so much inspiration. So I'd love for you to share with listeners just introduction to your story. How did you get involved in this movement, and what is the Sunrise Movement?
Sure. So hi, everybody. My name is Varshini Prakash. I am 25 years old. I hail from outside of Boston, Massachusetts, and I am one of the co-founders of and currently serving as the executive director for the Sunrise Movement, which is building a movement and an army of young people, really, to stop the climate crisis and create millions of good jobs for our generation. And we really see our work as lying at the nexus of both protest organizing and electoral organizing. And we work to get fossil fuel money out of our political system to elect climate champions to office who have our best interests at heart, and to start to build the public and political consensus around the real solutions to the climate crisis, like a Green New Deal. So I really got started in all of this work as a college student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where I was helping to run a fossil fuel divestment campaign. So getting our institutions to stop investing in oil, gas, and coal corporations that were destroying our generation's future. And led that campaign to victory, actually, after about 3 years. But about a year out from when Trump was elected to office, I think it was the fall or winter of 2015, a series of really horrible climate-fueled floods struck where my family is from in southern India. I remember, streets and roads that I had traveled to and visited just covered in 8 feet of water, like mothers and children walking miles to sanctuary. And thank God, my grandparents had been traveling at that time to visit family, because if they hadn't, they might have been caught in the deluge without food, without water, without electricity for days, perhaps even weeks. And so this was this really politicizing moment for me, where I realized that the floods were getting bigger, the hurricanes were getting stronger, the climate crisis was genuinely worsening. And yet our movements weren't growing, and our politicians weren't acting with the kind of haste and urgency that many young people and communities who are on the front lines of this crisis feel in their bones every single day. So I convened a team of alongside some other folks, convened a team of about 12 individuals from across the youth climate sphere. And we spent about a year and a half of strategic planning and organizing, studying the history of social movements, contemporary ones and historical examples, and ultimately launched Sunrise in July of 2017 with 6 people, all under the age of 26.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate the youth leadership, and we'll talk more about that as we get on with this interview. Just draw our listeners into this vision that you're creating of what true economic development could look like, and what the Green New Deal could look like. Why the jobs piece? Why the economics piece? Why is that important in this discussion around climate?
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many answers to that. But what I'll say is that for many, the Green New Deal is really trying to get at the two twin crises of the climate crisis, where, as recently as just a couple months ago, UN climate scientists are telling us that we quite literally have 12 years to make unprecedented changes to every aspect of our economy and society to essentially protect the future of humankind as we know it. So we're operating on an extremely short timeline. And if we fail to meet that timeline, could result in the demise for millions of people around the country suffering from pollution, the effects of worsening disasters, the spread of disease, the absolute extremities in weather, heat and cold, and the erraticness of our weather patterns as it relates to the climate crisis, amongst many, many other things like sea level rise and gentrification, et cetera, associated with the climate crisis. So that's one. And then the other one is inequity and inequality in our country and the world. We somehow have tolerated an economic system that allows for 8 people in the world to control as much wealth as the bottom 3.5 billion, which I can't even actually understand how much wealth that is. Like, that is an absurd, nauseating level of inequality that exists. And also permeates a lot of the American economic and social systems as well. So we've seen this real capture of our government by corporations and a wealthy and elite few, and seen the way in which inequality has really created so many issues in our society. And so the Green New Deal is saying that we can tackle both of these things at once, both the climate crisis and the crisis of inequality in this country and around the world. And what it is essentially is a massive mobilization of the United States, of our resources, our intellect, our ingenuity, and our creativity to get the United States to an 100% renewable energy future, to ensure that millions of people get access to good paying jobs and are guaranteed jobs in the economy, and make sure that we are also including communities that have historically been left out of economic prosperity, communities of color, Indigenous folks, low-income families, and more in this process as well. And so just a little bit of what you said on the jobs front is, like, for so long there has been this toxic, completely incorrect understanding of of climate action that has pitted jobs in the economy against climate action. And we are saying that that is not true, that is a lie that has been perpetrated by fossil fuel executives and billionaires in a wealthy class that wants to uphold the system of, like, burning and polluting that has driven the American economy for a while, to say that actually there are millions of jobs to be created. We'll have to fight for them to be good paying, unionized, like, jobs that are actually good for workers and include benefits and all of that, but that there is a huge opportunity here that it will actually be good for the economy to do a lot of the work associated with averting the climate crisis.
And I'm curious, you work with young people all the time. Could you paint a picture for our listeners around what is inspiring these young people? What are the types of jobs and tasks that your generation is prepared to take on if and when the Green New Deal goes forward?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, our generation's ready to go to work. I have never seen so many young people so energized and mobilized. On February 5th, quite literally at the same time that Trump will be delivering his State of the Union speech, over 440 simultaneous house parties are going to be occurring that are tuning into a national live stream as we unroll our campaign for a Green New Deal, so that young people all across the country can take up the mantle of pushing their federal policymakers to really figure out what kind of legislation we need to pass to confront the climate crisis and mobilize people to stop it. And we're seeing tens of thousands of people getting ready to participate in that campaign. And so I'm just really energized in this moment. And I think what is driving people, especially young people, is the focus on racial and wealth inequity that is really baked into the DNA of the Green New Deal, as well as this vision that's actually in line with what the climate science is telling us is necessary, which we have never seen before in American history, as long as we have known about the climate crisis.
You already spoke about power and the exorbitant and unequal power that exists in the current structures. could you take us into the vision? Who has power in this next economy, and what is your vision for the compassionate redistribution of power and wealth that is required for that?
Yeah, well, I would say my vision for this next economy is pretty simple. I think much of this stems from what our values are and how we articulate them, and the kind of society, government, economy that we are striving to create is one that should guarantee all people. This is going to sound extremely simple when I say it, but it's not a reality. So we've got some work to do, but a world where all people have the right to breathe clean air, to drink fresh water, to have access to a safe home and a livable future, and can live their lives in peace and dignity. And that seems like a no-brainer. That seems like something every person should have. And yet we live in a world where young Black children are 2, 3, 4, even 5 times as likely than other demographics to suffer from asthma rates. We live in an economy where communities of color are disproportionately feel the impacts of fossil fuel, oil and gas combustion and pollution. We're in a world where communities in the far Rockaways had to wait weeks to get their power turned on after Sandy, but communities in Manhattan got theirs turned out on days after. So the way in which inequity and inequality really maps on to the climate crisis is glaringly obvious. And so I think it all starts with like, what are the values that we're putting out there, and then deriving our policy and our economic policies, our political priorities, all from the basis of what is going to actually help people in this moment. And so, yeah, I think that's the economic worldview, and I'd like to see power. I'd see power in the form monetarily, politically, just in so many different ways, distributed in a much more equitable fashion that actually allows for communities that have been historically hurt by this country's either racist or classist or sexist policies to be given a shot also at their American dream.
It's so aligned with what we often talk about at Lift Economy, is looking at meeting needs, essential human needs and services first, before looking at, the kind of excessive or surplus, planned obsolescence that this economy creates.
Right.
So I'm really appreciating that shared value and ethic. I want to veer a little bit and talk about, I'm sure it's on your mind, and it's been on my mind too, how are we going to get this Green New Deal written and proposed and created? Talk a little bit about maybe your strategic plan, your theory of change. How does this actually happen?
Sure. Yeah. It's no small goal to pass a Green New Deal in this country. And honestly, it's not even going to look, I think when we think about what a Green New Deal was, we have to look back at our historical examples. The term Green New Deal came about because it harkens back to a historical example of the New Deal, which was a set of policies and programs passed in the FDR administration that really looked to elevate the working class and the middle class following the Great Depression. And it wasn't just one giant New Deal bill or piece of legislation. It was like a series of programs that were rolled out over a decade or more of time that really started to create a new common sense in America of who government should be for and who we take care of and why. And so in a very similar way, we think that solving the climate crisis is going to involve many pieces of legislation over many decades of time, starting now. And that is going to require, in order to make that kind of like massive transformation, we think we need 3 really, really key ingredients. One is a heck of a lot of people power. So that looks like a very large, very vocal, very active base of people who are just clamoring for a Green New Deal, both at the ballot box, who are participating in organizations and movements like Sunrise, who are, feeding the participating in a whole number of ways. So if you're out there listening to this, you should join the movement if you haven't already at sunrisemovement.org. The second ingredient is political power. So we actually, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and other leaders like her have been really pushing the conversation about a Green New Deal. But like, truth be told, we need 50 Alexandria Ocasio-Cortezes. We need people who see this issue as theirs, who are championing it, who are sticking their necks out, who are fighting tooth and nail to make it a reality, because that's the way that politics is going to change. And then lastly, we think we need like thousands and thousands of advocacy, citizen action, mobilization groups, think tanks, economists, electoral organizations, academics, more, who are actually business folks, who are coming together around this vision for a Green New Deal and who are advocating for it in every part of society. So Sunrise's strategy really focuses on these three pillars that we think we need to pass a Green New Deal. We're working really actively to build the people power side of things. We've exploded in the last year. We have, like, in the last 2 months, we've gotten over 100 new Sunrise chapters. So there are 135 Sunrise chapters in existence right now, hoping to get that up to like 300 by the end of the year. We're working to get thousands of groups supporting and signed on to advocate for a Green New Deal. And we have seen almost every major presidential contender on the Democratic side embrace, to varying degrees, a Green New Deal. And so we're going to be pushing those politicians to keep a Green New Deal at the top of their political agenda and be talking about it through all these primary debates and the general election next year, and ensure that by 2020, the climate crisis and really through a Green New Deal has become one of the top political priorities in our nation.
You are working so beautifully and imperatively on the systems shift, the kind of macro systemic piece. Are you also seeing in your movement how that ripples out into the personal activism and the kind of personal responsibility of people taking daily action to address the climate crisis? And how do you see those two as relating to one another?
Well, you can't get the system changed if you don't have millions of those people doing the daily activism. This stuff isn't rocket science. It's like millions of people, or, at this point, it's like tens of thousands of people every day who are meeting, talking, showing up every place that their politicians are, showing up with signs.
I think it's a really important thing to address because for example, I've seen finger-pointing redirect happen on the political playing field, and I've seen it be an attack at activism. And I think one of the powerful things that we're realizing, especially in the recent decades, is that the reason we're all addicted to fossil fuels is because of systemic reasons, right? And so I'm just curious how that discourse and sophistication of the understanding of the crisis and how the multinational corporations are perpetuating the addiction to fossil fuels, and how at the same time there is a sense of personal responsibility that I see, at least in my generation, that are going back to farming, going to participating in resilient solar installs, kind of off the grid living, dramatic reduction in consumption patterns. So I'd love to hear kind of how that's showing up in your world.
Right. So to your point about the systemic nature of how we got into this whole mess, because of a lot of campaigns that people have run, and just because of what we know about our own history, we know that corporations like ExxonMobil had some of the best climate science back in the 70s and early 80s, and were extremely well aware that the planet's temperature was warming and that it would be catastrophic for our generation and future generations, and potentially completely destabilizing the world economy. And I think that at the moment when they realized that it was actually going to hurt, first and foremost, their bottom line, they chose, instead of changing their ways and changing their the profit motives of those industries, they chose to actually invest billions of dollars into both buying out politicians of both political parties, although the corporate capture of the GOP in particular has been really, really intense over the last year. And it's been clear in the way that most of that party has wholesale embraced climate denialism. But also that Democrats have received money from the industry as well, and have while they have avowed to do something about the crisis, haven't done anything nearly commensurate to the scale and magnitude of what we're anticipating is coming down the line. So there has been this really wild systemic apparatus that's been created, and that's defining our reality right now. And at the same time, people are telling us, oh, like, leave it to the markets, to figure it out. And while there's definitely changes happening and investment in renewables and all of that, if we, waiting for the markets to change an entire global economy at scale in the next 12 years is frankly absurd, and it's never going to happen. And so I actually think that the personal activism, the personal decisions that people make that added up actually move us to make these macro political changes. And with the analysis of the systemic reason why we got here, we can actually propose the solutions. I think that personal activism is so essential, and we literally cannot do anything on the scale of what a Green New Deal is talking about unless millions of people actually rise up and say that we need it and stop business as usual from continuing forward until we get it. So I think those pieces really play very closely together.
Do you think youth in particular are particularly suited because at a point in your life where you haven't necessarily chosen a career path that is industry, talk a little bit about why youth leadership, why now?
Totally. I mean, I think we just have to go back into our history again, and it's very telling of who has actually supported, started, and moved massive transformations in our country's past. On the precipice of great calamity, for prior to massive civil rights victories and things like that, it was always young people who were the vanguards of social change. We saw that in the civil rights movement and the LGBTQ movements, in women's suffrage. We saw it in so many different movements in our history's past that have forced such big changes in our society and had ripple effects for generations. So I think it makes sense that young people who also have some of the most at stake if we don't win this climate fight, who will literally inherit potentially a chaotic and broken world that is careening into war and violence and famine, is particularly positioned to fight for the adequate solutions that we need to literally live our lives in peace. So I think I've seen a lot of energy from young people because of that. We're pissed at the generations above us who have gotten us into this mess, who still are dragging their heels to do anything substantive about it. And I think there's a real feeling amongst young people of looking out around us and asking, like, where are the adults in the room? Like, who is taking responsibility for this mess? And seeing no one, feeling like we need to take up the mantle ourselves.
It's a great segue. I want to talk a little bit about what you look for in a leader and what leadership in this new era looks like to you. And it's, you talk about needing 50 more Alexandria Ocasio-Cortezes. And so, talk about what you're screening for in leadership right now.
Yeah. I mean, are you talking about political leadership?
I would love to hear about political leadership from you.
Okay, great. Because when you said leaders, I didn't actually immediately think politicians. I actually immediately thought people in our base who are, 17 and leading busloads of young high school students to actions. I think I'm looking for in a politician someone who is unafraid to call for the kinds of solutions to the greatest crises of our lifetimes that's actually in line with what the vast majority of people need and want. We've seen massive support for policies like a Green New Deal, like Medicare for all, like raising the minimum wage, ending cash bail, a number of different things that have massive and overwhelming public support. And yet too few politicians who are actually have the kind of moral conviction and courage to put their necks out and take a risk and call for it. But we see that when they do, they become some of the most popular politicians in our country. For example, Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And so I think I'm looking for somebody who actually has deep values that are centered on ensuring that people have the rights to a good and healthy and safe life, and that they are accountable first and foremost to people, not to the people who bankroll their campaigns or wealthy elites or corporate executives first and foremost.
And I love that when I asked you about leadership, you imagined the 17-year-old leader in your base. So
definitely.
Talk a little bit more about that leadership thing.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's part of the best part of being in a movement is it's leaderful. There's just so much leadership and it looks like so many different things. Like, I just feel like I'm constantly inspired by people. For example, like my colleague, Victoria Fernandez, who runs our digital team and is coordinating quite literally hundreds of events and distributed actions and house parties and is really the machine behind all of our online work. And I'm so inspired by her every day and what she does. And she doesn't get a lot of public recognition, but it is just such a champion and is doing the work that is what people see of Sunrise on the outside. There's just so many people like that every day. There's 12-year-olds who are out in Denver, Colorado, who are striking from school every Friday because of the climate crisis and are calling on other young people to take action with them. I met young people from Kentucky who are so mad at the way that Mitch McConnell has put up their state for sale to the coal industry, and the way in which Trump has taken advantage of the state of existence for coal miners in their state, and is rising up to fight back against that and say that, no, you don't define Kentucky, you don't define who we are, and is calling for a Green New Deal in the midst of that. So I'm just there's so many examples I could point to. The list would go on forever, but we're just seeing this new moral leadership from young people on the issue of climate that is so meaningful, of young people starting to rise up and use their voice to really hold our politicians' feet to the fire, and say that time is running out and you need to answer to us.
You brought up coal in Kentucky, and one thing that comes to mind is how a lot of agricultural communities around the country also have a role to play in the climate crisis with regards to the types of growing practices we use and how we change the nature of how we grow our food in this country. I'm curious, I know the Green New Deal has been primarily focused on the energy piece, but are you also looking at other sectors of our economy, whether that be the way we grow our food, agriculture?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, the Green New Deal is talking about eliminating all warming emissions from every sector of society. So that includes, yes, the energy sector, but also transportation, agriculture, industry, and other ways. And definitely see agriculture as being a contributor to the climate crisis, and also leading, the way in which our current agricultural economy is organized, leading to less healthy food and less healthy soil, and hurting the very ecosystems that feed and sustain us. So yeah, I think there's a lot of place within the Green New Deal for thinking creatively about things like regenerative agriculture, about what it would mean to produce our food sustainably, and more.
Who else in this climate movement is inspiring you right now? Where are you looking outside of Sunrise Movement, outside of politics for inspiration?
That's a great question. Outside of politics too. Well, sometimes Cardi B talks about the New Deal on her Instagram, and it's very inspiring to me because that reached millions of people and it was great. So keep it up, Cardi B. She's been reading her history. I think, but no, I've actually been really inspired by the way that media giants and celebrities have been getting involved and actually getting really political, which I think is great. And I've also been looking to, like a lot of contemporary movements. Sunrise spent a lot of time studying and getting inspired by other movements for social change too, feeling really inspired by the movement for Black Lives, the fight for Medicare for all that is, still getting bigger and more powerful and has completely shifted public opinion in the last few years. And so I'm just, a lot of the movements for immigrant justice, especially in this moment when the onslaught of attacks on people's families and children and just basic ability to live and thrive is being terrorized by the Trump administration, have been honestly so moved by the level of resilience and the spirit and strength of the immigrant rights movements as well.
And how can listeners support you? What do you need right now, you and your team and the work you're doing? How can listeners really stand up and stand in solidarity and support?
Yeah, get involved. That is definitely the number one thing we need from y'all. So join either Sunrise Movement, sunrisemovement.org. You can go on there, sign up for our list, and get involved in all of the amazing things that are happening this year and next through that. Also, if you, we are a people-powered movement, and we also rely on grassroots donations in a big way to power our work forward. So if you can also donate via Venmo at Sunrise MVMT, if that's something you use, or if not, you can also donate on our website. But we need you if you are worried about the climate crisis, if you're pissed off at the corporate capture of our government by fossil fuel elites, if you are just want a world where all people can live and thrive and be who they are, I would heavily encourage you to join us.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Are there any last words you'd like to share with our listeners before we close our conversation today?
I think that's it. Yeah. Thank you.
It's been such a pleasure talking with you.
All right. Yeah.
And really grateful that the youth of our country are really taking a stand for a stable climate. So gratitude.
Me too. All right. Thanks, Erin.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.